We have a very special edition of the Page Perspective today, an interview edition, because I read this amazing book that is out today that you definitely need to get. And we are joined by the author of that book today. The book is There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. And the author is Brian Goldstone. Brian, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Brittany.
I can't say enough about this book. I think it's such a remarkable achievement to combine immersive storytelling with real education on the systemic policy failures that have caused our homelessness crisis and that exacerbate our homelessness crisis. I'm excited to get into all of that with you today. I do want to start, though, because there was a bit of a controversy that you ran into with your book release last month when you had a book event canceled. At the Carter Library Center. The event was canceled after Trump's leadership change at the National Archives. I think book events for two other books were canceled as well, like a book about the civil rights movement and climate change. What was your reaction when you learned that your book event had been canceled?
It was absolutely shocking. It was demoralizing. It was discouraging. When I heard about these two other book events that were also canceled, I realized I was in good company. And but ultimately, we were sort of left in the dark as to what actually went down. We know that other events on less, I guess, threatening subjects were kept on the books. And only these particular book events on homelessness, climate change, the civil rights movement were singled out.
How
Um,
threatening.
Yes, but we don't know if that was a directive that came from Washington or whether this was the Carter Library preemptively trying to cancel things to avoid controversy. And I think either scenario is totally chilling and disturbing.
Right? Kind of the obeying in advance that we've been hearing so much about.
Exactly, exactly. And I just
Yeah.
never imagined that, a book that is trying to expose the pervasiveness and scale and severity of housing insecurity and homelessness in this country would be seen as subversive or potentially threatening. But I guess that's the time we're now living in.
Right. And I wonder how much of that is because your book may be challenging a lot of conventional thinking, a lot of stereotypes that people have about homelessness. And I mean, some people may be surprised by the title, even, right? That working and homeless in America, in part because many people have a very incorrect view about what causes homelessness or the types of people that become homeless. What is your response when you hear someone blame, for example, like we hear so often, substance use or mental illness as a cause of homelessness, or when you hear people advance the usual narratives about the kind of person that experiences
Yeah.
homelessness, like they're lazy or, they don't want the help or they're comfortable on the street? How do you respond to things like that?
Yeah, the fact is that from the very beginning of America's crisis of mass homelessness, which really began as so many of our societal maladies began in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, from the very beginning, there was a concerted effort to shape the public perception around homelessness, to make it a problem of persons, as one scholar refers to it, rather than a problem of policy. And, at that time, the social safety net was in the process of being decimated, and the budget for public housing was being gutted, and support for poor and working class families in America were being stripped away. And instead of confronting that reality, federal funding for research on homelessness was only given to researchers and projects that focused on substance use and mental health issues. Anything that focused on racism or housing discrimination or any of the other sort of variety of factors that were leading to this crisis were not funded. So there was even a Life magazine story, I believe, or Time magazine story called Reagan versus the Social Sciences. And so from the very start, there has been this effort to shape the story we tell ourselves as a country. And the most convenient story has been one that blames it on these kind of, personal individual pathologies rather than looking at it as a societal pathology.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting part of the book where you talked about that intentional messaging that took place to turn the public perspective into a focus on, like you said, individual pathology rather than the systemic failures. And I find it interesting that, that started, like you said, in the 80s. And it has only grown stronger. And people seem to be falling into that trap still to this day. What do you think is so difficult about breaking through and helping remove that narrative of the individual pathology and getting people to see the systemic failures, the policy failures that created this and exacerbate the crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think the very first thing we have to do is acknowledge the reality of what homelessness actually looks like in this country and what actually causes it. It's undeniable that there are people on the street, the people who are most visibly suffering on the street and in encampments, that substance use and mental health issues are there. I think it would be counterproductive and just factually not true to deny that there are people struggling. But to say that that's what caused those people to become homeless is a leap that is unwarranted by every available piece of research and data that we have. So there's the question of causes. I like to say that that people, even people in the street who are using fentanyl or are in the throes um, of severe mental illness, those conditions on their own no more caused them to become homeless than a fever causes the flu, right? This is this in many cases is a byproduct of the experience of being without shelter and without a home in this country. Those conditions arise from it, but it's also super, super important. And this is a big point that I'm trying to make in the book. It's important to recognize that what we see on the street is only the tip of the iceberg. There's this vast population that we don't see, mostly families with children. Even in the 1980s, when homelessness was exploding, the fastest growing segment of the total homeless population were children under the age of 6. And yet that is completely lost in sort of the media sensationalism around homelessness. It's lost in policymakers' discussions of homelessness. And that's absolutely true today as well. About, I would say, 80 to 90% of people experiencing homelessness in America are families with children. And they are also in the labor force, as are, incidentally, many people on the streets and in shelters. So there's all sorts of misconceptions about sort of the characteristics of those experiencing homelessness, the demographic features of those experiencing homelessness. But above all, there's a sort of radical misapprehension about what causes it. And what causes it is fundamentally a lack of safe, stable housing for poor and working class people.
And you focus on 5 families in the book. And I think it's really profound to go on this journey with these families.
Mm.
And the way that you write about their experiences, you can just feel how hard they're trying to escape
Mm.
the
Mm.
cycle that they're in and the financial precarity, right? Without going over that cliff. They're trying to prevent that from happening. They're trying to everything that they can. And they can't make it happen because, like we keep going back to, a lot of these systemic and policy failures, these obstacles that are put in their place. What was it like for you to be up close and witness those experiences, witness how hard these people are working, trying to get out of their station in life, while at the same time hearing these narratives so often advanced about how lazy poor people are or people on the street are? What was it like to be face to face with seeing how not true that is?
Yeah. It was crushing. It was absolutely heart-wrenching. Um, I think part of why it was so gutting to witness was because of the ways in which, despite the structural forces that pushed people into homelessness, that pushed people into this precarity, that pushed these parents and their children into these dangerous and precarious situations. And I use the language of pushed very intentionally because my reporting shows that these families did not fall into homelessness. This wasn't like a natural disaster, or they didn't just trip and they ended up homeless, there was bad luck. There were so many points where policies and structures, you could just see them being pushed. Whether a lack of basic tenant protections or habitability requirements for apartments, and they end up not paying the rent and getting evicted. There's so many points where it was just watching people be pushed off a cliff. And what was so hard was seeing how, despite that, people blamed themselves. Like these parents, they blamed themselves for not being able to give their children a roof over head. And I think that was probably the hardest thing, is just how much shame was wrapped up on this, the ways that these men and women had internalized kind of this national verdict that we have placed on those who are suffering in this way. But yeah, it was a very, very hard and transformative experience to
And
bear
that
witness to this.
it certainly comes through. I mean, there were definitely moments where I was in tears reading it. I had to take a break. I had to come back to it, but it's important, even though it's hard to read, because it's informational. And I think one of the important things that you cover is how difficult it is to escape homelessness. And once you're kind of in this cycle of financial precarity, the lengthy process to even get temporary assistance or to get a housing voucher. And then once you have a housing voucher, the limited options that are available to you and the obstacles that are in place there. At
Mm,
every turn, we really get a glimpse of how complicated that process is.
yeah.
Can you illuminate some of that difficult process for the people who are watching this who may have doubts about it, how difficult it is?
Yeah, I remember talking to a case manager at one point who was like, "Look, the services are out there. These folks need to just access the services." And to that person and to anyone else who would say such a thing, I would say, "Go try it yourself.
Mm.
Go call 311, whatever the number is in your city, and try to access services." I'm thinking not just of the families in Atlanta who I followed over several years, but the mother and her kids in Detroit, uh, who recently reached out to the sort of emergency number for assistance for families experiencing homelessness, not once, not twice, I believe 3 times, and got nowhere. I don't even think got a response. And then she was in a van with her children, and two of them ended up um, freezing to death. Um, and it illustrates the fact that a lot of people are falling through the cracks, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we define homelessness so narrowly. Again, we define homelessness around that very narrow sliver of the total homeless population that is um, on the street or chronically homeless, and we neglect the 80 or 90% of others, mostly families with children. And and I think that has a lot to do with why the families who I follow in the book just face one barrier after another in trying to access even a modicum of support.
It reminds me that a lot of the conversations that we seem to have surrounding homelessness are reactive. And in
Mhm.
the book, I think you talk about how, like, you have to actually be on the street or in a shelter to get help. And there isn't a lot of help that you can get before you're already at this very low point that it's going to be difficult to help you. And that seems like a reactive stance, right? Especially when we're in a situation with half of all renters are cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. It seems like this should be more of a priority to be a little bit more proactive. What are some policy priorities that you think people should be thinking about in order to move us from that reactive stance to that proactive stance?
Yeah, that's such a key question because so much I mean, to the extent that policy exists in America that is designed to um, tackle homelessness, it's overwhelmingly oriented around just getting people out of homelessness, right? Like getting them into permanent supportive housing and or build a couple of tiny homes where people who are on the street can get uh, wraparound services. All of that is really, really important, but we will never meaningfully address this growing catastrophe of homelessness in America unless we start talking about preventing it before, stopping homelessness before it happens. We have to talk about prevention. And when we talk about prevention, we're now opening up a terrain that does not typically get discussed in talking about sort of solutions to homelessness. I have in mind like just strengthening tenant rights and giving people facing evictions a right to counsel, guaranteeing them a lawyer, uh, just cause eviction protections that, for instance, would make it illegal for a landlord not to renew a lease just because they want to sell the property and make a profit. There's all sorts of ways that we can keep families and keep individuals in the homes they already have. And until we address that, we're never going to stop this relentless churn, which in some cities, like in LA or San Francisco, sees for every one person who's able to secure housing, another, 4 people become homeless. So until we interrupt that cycle, we will never meaningfully address this catastrophe.
I've been thinking a lot about in the context of, growing conversations about oligarchy and the need for class solidarity, my own inability in the past to acknowledge my own financial precarity, in times when I've been poor and like counting change to put gas in my car, or my credit cards were maxed out, and like how close I was to the edge.
Yeah.
But if you had asked me at that time if I was poor, I probably would have told you no, because in my mind, poor meant something like from my childhood, like actually being on food stamps or actually needing to ask the church people for money, like things like that. And so I wonder how much of some of the resistance that we see to some of these policies is a refusal of people to maybe acknowledge their own financial precarity.
Mm.
And what a difficult dance that is of, you need to survive, you need to get through day to day, and you can't be constantly thinking about how close you are to financial precarity. But if you're in it, it seems like it's good to acknowledge that you are there in order to have some of that class solidarity to support policies like rent control and things like that. I guess I'm just kind of ranting.
No, no.
There's no
Can I
question
can I
there.
speak to that? Can I
Yeah.
speak to that quickly? Because I think it's so important that we to acknowledge that when we talk about poverty and homelessness being a really extreme form of poverty, when we talk about poverty or homelessness in America, the 2 options we tend to be given are either judgment or charity, right?
Mm.
But both judgment and charity imply a distance. And part of what the term working homeless does, I think in some ways, is it it sort of explodes that distance, right? Because now it's not someone who's just been, struck with some, struck with some misfortune, and we just have to. It's it's a condition that is baked into the very economic and political and social fabric that we as a country have designed for ourselves, and so the sort of profound intimacy and proximity of us, whoever a well-off us is, and them really begins to disappear. And that's also why I try to show that it's actually, it's not just a case of like extreme wealth coexisting alongside this growing deprivation. There's a causal dimension where the growing wealth of a few is actually fueling the insecurity and deprivation of the many. So there's a causal relationship. It's not just a matter of it kind of coexisting alongside. And I think ultimately it's important to go beyond even this like intimacy to say that so many of us ourselves are at risk of being in the very position that we might be feeling compassion towards someone else today. And so you're absolutely right. I think that in even some of the families I followed in the book, there was a kind of block for them in even acknowledging or recognizing that they were homeless or that they were poor. There was always someone worse off than them. And there was also sort of a psychic block, I think, in accepting that because of the stigma and the identity that sort of in their mind came along with that. Um, but but for sure, the lines are so porous now more than ever.
The term working homeless, I think, also challenges kind of some of the tendency I think that the public has to engage with like the just world hypothesis, right? This idea that good people have good things coming to them and bad people have bad things coming to them. And then if they look at someone that's experiencing a hardship, they're able to go through whatever rationalizations that they need to in order to determine that what is happening to that person is just. So they made a mistake, they did something wrong, that's why that's happening to them. But when you hear the term working homeless, it kind of shifts that a little bit, because then you hear that someone is working as hard as they possibly can and they're still in this situation. So they didn't choose this. They didn't make a mistake to cause this to happen. In fact, they're trying as hard as they can to not let that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a long tradition in America going back to the colonial period of sort of imagining the deserving versus the undeserving poor, right? And the deserving poor were those um, who were trying their hardest, who were able-bodied and working and still weren't able to provide for themselves, or those more often who were, women, children, those who were infirm, and those were the people who were supposedly worthy of our sympathy and compassion. Um, but yeah, to talk about the working homeless is to talk about people who have really they're doing what America says they are supposed to do. They're working not just one job, but often two jobs, three jobs. They're working and working and working some more, and it's still not enough to access one of life's most basic necessities. So the point in talking about the working homeless is not to say, oh, here's unhoused folks who are more deserving of our compassion. It's to say, isn't it time that we reconsider both of those words, work and homelessness? What is it about the nature of work in America and the nature of housing in America that has allowed that concept to emerge with such force?
It's such an important point. It's also reminding me of the part in the book where you show this tension between survival and activism. And it's when people were being abused by this extended stay hotel that they were staying in, and they came together to protest and fight back against the injustice. And we saw the struggle to organize your community while at the same time trying to survive, right? And it reminds me of that saying, like, find your empathy before your tragedy, before something bad has to happen to you, like join with people to prevent these bad things from happening, even if it's not personally impacting you. And I guess along the same lines of this conversation, it just made me think about how, how can we get people who are stably housed, who are maybe not in a financial precarious position, to join with those who are in more of a precarious financial situation, to be more forward-looking about policy?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
It's a big question, I know.
one way to answer that is to say, to go back to what we were speaking about a moment ago, which is how unstable these categories are, these positions in life are. So many people, not just the working class and the poor, but the sort of downwardly mobile middle class as well, is at risk of losing their housing right now in this country. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands, but really tens of millions of Americans who may very well find themselves in this position, especially if the supports that keep people in their homes continue to get stripped away, as it seems is happening right now under the current administration. So one answer to that question is that there's a lot more people impacted than I think we would like to believe. But as far as how do we get those who are relatively stable, to care about those who aren't. I don't know. I mean, part of it is like, what kind of country do we want? What kind of cities do we want? A lot of the book is kind of looking at the nature of growth in our, most booming and successful urban centers. And, what we see like here in Atlanta where I live is that the city's renaissance, the city's, you can hear my dog in the background. Um, the city's fun and amenities, all of that is coming at the cost, not of these people over there who are poor and unfortunate, but the very workers who power the city and make its sort of success possible right now. And I think when people awaken to that reality, they will care about their neighbors. But part of it, of course, goes back to where we started, which is we have to dismantle the stereotypes and myths about those who are experiencing insecurity, because it's the imagination that the ways we imagine those who have been deprived, the ways we imagine those experiencing this acute precarity, that often creates a kind of mental refusal um, to look at the reality of who they are and the reality of their situation. So that's why I think storytelling is so important. That's why I think narrative is so important, um, because we have to um, this isn't just an abstract data point. These are people's lives. These are children's lives. These are children's futures. And I think if people learned about like the toxic stress that the children I write about in the book are experiencing so utterly unnecessarily, they will care enough to stop it from continuing. That's what I
Right.
would love to believe.
And the lifelong impact of that stress as well.
Absolutely.
As a therapist myself, I really identified with someone in the book. I believe the name was Carla, a
Mm,
case manager with an
mhm.
organization working
Yes.
with individuals experiencing homelessness, a person who actually seemed to really care, but her ability to help was kind of constrained by the system, I would say.
Mm,
And it seems that the systemic failures that make it difficult for people to escape homelessness and obtain help are the same systemic failures that create burnout and frustration among the workers who are
right,
trying to help. And I'm
right.
wondering if you see it that way.
Yeah, Carla Wells is an incredible human being, and yeah, she really, I think, got burned out. I think she would use those words, and part of it was, her desire to bring about actual change and to actually improve the lives of her clients, and not just her clients, but all of those who were being turned away because of the lack of resources. Um, I that desire ran up against the sort of grim reality of what she, had at hand to work with, and yeah, she's the one who really called out that sort of unending churn where it's like you're just playing whack-a-mole, and you get one family the help they need, and like 4, 5, 6 other families, it's not just that they now need help, they're actually being turned away. And I think she saw that, and she saw, the racism baked into that. She saw the arbitrariness of so much of, the so many of the definitions that determine who gets help and who doesn't, the kind of hoops people have to jump through, the bureaucratic hurdles, the the shaming of those who are poor and who need housing. And ultimately, she saw that as a caseworker, you can only do so much when you're up against what she refers to as the housing hunger games,
Mm.
where a private market ruled by, landlords and developers whose sole, motivate is to maximize their profits, which, okay, that's what they're doing. But there's no intervention on the part of the state or the government uh, to create conditions where families who are poor are left to fend for themselves in this sort of what Carla calls this Hunger Games like environment, where this basic human necessities just auctioned off to the highest bidder. And if you're not fortunate enough to afford it, you're left on your own. And I think she just saw how insurmountable those those conditions are, those odds are. And yeah, I think she got burned out by it.
For people who are watching this and want to get involved, want to participate in advocacy or organizing in some way in their communities, what advice would you give them? What would you say for how people can get involved and contribute to good in this area?
Yeah. Uh, I think, I mean, there's a range of very practical steps that people can take. I would say that maybe the most practical step is to talk to people, ask them questions. Um, you see a family. I see families here a lot in Atlanta who are clearly like living in their car or asking for money outside of a grocery store. Instead of just deciding whether or not to give them money, and yes, you should give them money, ask them what is your life like? What led you to be here? Be curious. Read stories. Hopefully, books like this. Hopefully that that make you first feel in a visceral way what it's like for parents for their kids when this most basic human need is always just out of reach, or where they were pushed out of stable, safe housing for because it was no longer profitable for this or that landlord or investor. So the first thing is just to ask, to listen, to be curious about why so many people are in this predicament. And yeah, go to your local city council meetings. So much of housing policy in America happens not in DC, but actually, down the street from you in wherever your city council meetings are held. Um, when people are voting on whether to have an affordable housing complex built in their neighborhood, be the person in the audience who is demanding that, yes, this needs to be built. Screw our property values. Screw the character of our neighborhood. Be that person. But also demand legislation from your governor, from your local policymakers that, again, keep people in the homes they already have, that strengthen tenant protections, which in so many states in this country are virtually non-existent. The power asymmetry between tenants and landlords, the people who are fortunate enough to own property, and the many, many more who are unfortunate and don't own property, that power asymmetry is extreme. So be the person who's demanding that that asymmetry be rectified, and find out if there's a tenant union in your city or in your state, and get involved in the actions that they are engaged in. Um, yeah, I would say start there.
I love that. I love that. You could keep going too. I could feel it. Those are all great. And I appreciate your time. I want to ask you one more question before you go. And this is a question that I like to end with because I like to encourage the audience to change their mind when the facts change or when their understanding of the facts change. So in the spirit of that, can you tell us, Brian, what is the most recent thing that you have changed your mind about?
Yeah, I think what we were just talking about is actually the perfect segue to my answer to this question, which is that, when I began working on this project now about 6 years ago, I think I was under sort of this vague assumption that if America's housing and homelessness crisis is going to end, if it's going to be meaningfully addressed, it will happen when some really bold, legislature, some bold politician proposes this kind of transformative vision. And and I think what I've changed my mind about is the idea that change, if it comes, will come from the top. I absolutely firmly believe that if change is going to happen, it's going to happen when those impacted directly by this structural violence say, this is intolerable, and they band together and they refuse to take it any longer, in a similar way to how the labor movement in America transformed the power differential between owners and workers. In the same way, tenants, those affected, have to come together and say, we won't take it anymore. And those who are not directly impacted yet need to care enough about their neighbors to join them.
Mhm.
And I think that that is what I've changed my mind about, that and also to have hope, that as grim, as bleak as things are right now, incredible transformation can come not despite those overwhelming odds, but through them, in the midst of them. The seeds are planted often in the most grim and overpowering circumstances. So I think I've changed my mind about that as well.
I think that's a great answer. And it is a hopeful answer too, because it lends itself to the fact that we have agency, right? And
Yes.
we can band together and we can make choices, and this can be different. I think a lot of times I hear from people who are very demoralized after the election and they feel like it's over and there's going to be no progress ever again. But I think it's good to remind ourselves that we can make that progress. It's just that we need to get involved, get organized, and get together, because there are more of us than there are of them, certainly.
Yeah. And if I could just add one thing to that,
Yeah.
it's let's not allow our vision of a just society to be conditioned and determined by whatever the current powers that be decide the conversation will be about. So like right now, it may seem utopian to talk about the human right to housing at a moment when unhoused people are at risk of being rounded up and put in detention facilities or camps. I mean, as is already happening, like it happened before the Super Bowl in New Orleans, people just being
Hmm.
rounded up. And it may seem hopelessly idealistic to talk about treating housing as a basic human right, building millions of social housing units in America, which is really what's needed to address this problem at scale. That may seem utopian, but let's not allow our vision to be determined by what they decide we should be talking about.
Well, Brian, I cannot thank you enough for joining me today and talking about your book. Again, There Is No Place for Us Working and Homeless in America. It is out now. If you are watching this, it is out now, and you can get it anywhere, but I'm also going to be linking in the description below to where you can get it. So, Brian Goldstone, thank you so much for joining me today. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the book, your work, and you for being here today.
Thank you, Brittany. Likewise.